An Eye for an Eye podcast contains materials that may not be suited for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in Count 1 of the County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being, as charged in Count 2 of the information.
So let's kick this off, Matt. This is episode 1. We're about to kill it.
Absolutely, episode 1. So we actually thought for episode 1 we'd get this started with, like I said, a case that probably everybody, I think, unless you've been living under a rock, has heard about. The O.J. Simpson trials, I will say. He has had 2 significant stints in the American justice system.
He just can't stay out of the limelight.
Can't manage to get himself out of the limelight. And actually, today's date, we're sitting here July 19th, 2017, recording this. And tomorrow, July 20th, 2017, is O.J. Simpson's first parole hearing for his second sentence for which he was convicted, which we will talk about a little bit further down the line here. But I'd like to actually kick it off by introducing our first ever guest star.
Yay!
One of my favorite people, if not my favorite person, my brother, John Ryan. He is, if not the most avid sports watcher I've ever met, he's definitely up there. But he and I have at length discussed this case, I would say just as much as any sports fan that knows their salt has. And we wanted to get his opinion. We'd love to have you discuss a little bit about what you know and chime in a little bit here, bro.
Thank you, Matt and Lisa. Happy to join you guys in your first ever podcast. I'm excited to hear how all the cases moving forward. Tomorrow, OJ with his first ever parole hearing. It's hard to believe, isn't it?
This is going to be a fun one for
Considering
sure.
back in 2008, sentenced to 33 years.
33 years, yes, he was. After everybody heard about the trial of the century, of the 20th century, that was the initial bout with the court system that OJ had, but he might have gotten a little reciprocity there, we think. So
we're going to go into that.
So, we'll get into that.
Eye for an eye, right?
Eye for an eye,
we'll
exactly.
see, yeah.
There you go. Cheers to that, brother.
Cheers. We're actually drinking some
We're cracking a sour beer here and having a good time all watching the Pirate game, talking about this. So I'm gonna dive in. Yeah, we're gonna get started. How we're gonna do most of these Eye for an Eye webinar casts is start out with a little bit of case facts. Just for those of you that may not know a little bit about the details, obviously this one is going to be a little bit rehearsed. Everybody's seen it. It's been covered more than anything maybe ever. So, but I'm going to dive in a little bit about O.J. Simpson's history, then talk a little bit about the first trial, the trial of the century, quote unquote, that took place back in the mid-90s, and then we will get a little bit into that and the period between then and leading up to his second stint with the justice system. So let's start off. We're going to talk a little bit about O.J. now. We're talking about one of, I think, college football, if not just football in general's greatest athletes of the last millennia,
Without a doubt. He's a top 3 college football player of all time, in my opinion.
The Juice is probably the most well-known, though. He's
1969, number 1 overall pick, NFL draft.
Exactly, to our Buffalo Bills. God love them. And, O.J., he had a long career, not only of being well-known for his football prominence. He played in the NFL for, more than 10 seasons, I think 10 or 11 seasons, and then he ended up coming on as a broadcaster, and he became an actor, and he was, as much as you could possibly imagine, a guy going from...
Jack of all trades,
exactly. He came from a poor area of Los Angeles, not a very well-spoken guy from what historical accounts have told us when he first came to SC, but he really kind of adopted that sort of man of Southern California. We have a few friends and a few family that have gone there that they talk about it's a little bit of a prestige thing, and I think OJ sort of
without a doubt, yeah, he was the man. I mean,
absolutely.
And he loved it. That's
American hero, really, right?
He lived for it.
Absolutely,
yeah.
yes.
People magazine described him at one time as the first black athlete to be a bona fide, lovable media superstar.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. I mean, you got to think about it. Over how much time are we talking about here? That's pretty significant. So, and now I'd also like to touch a little bit on aside from OJ himself. Obviously, his fame, his status, got him to where he was, and what made him so marketable, I think, was his adaptability. He kind of became whatever people wanted him to be, and I think that in the time that he was alive, particularly that he was relevant in L.A., was one of the most tenuous times, civil rights and racially speaking, maybe in American history. Obviously, none of us sitting here were alive to experience that, but I think historical accounts will tell you, we've never really seen the type of strain that was on the community that was in Los Angeles back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, what are we talking about here? That was one of the most divided communities in the world, probably, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that obviously contributes to a lot of the tension that built up. So, leading up to what happened with O.J. Simpson, he was married to a woman named Nicole Brown. She was from a fairly well-known, fairly wealthy Los Angeles, Southern California family. Had a beautiful woman,
gorgeous.
Obviously, yeah, very
gorgeous,
very well liked among the socialite community in L.A. And they got out a lot. As we were saying, O.J. was well liked among the wealthy and famous, and he was marketable for everybody, so they all wanted OJ around. He was the juices, John Ryan was saying. So that, unfortunately, was only what we saw in the public light from a lot of accounts that have been told from Nicole's family, friends of both of the parties involved, that there was a lot of behind-the-scenes abuse going on between OJ and Nicole, that it was whether it be verbal abuse, often led to physical abuse. I think LAPD was called to their home when they were married. How many times? 3 or 4 or something?
Yeah, there were multiple accounts where domestic violence.
So yeah, obviously now that had something to do with what led up to the night in question here. The first time we ever heard OJ, though, really be reputed to be a little off. He had Nicole Brown after they were divorced. They had 2 children, but he had her tailed home, I believe, one night from a bar restaurant that she was at with a few friends. Yeah, and then showed up at her house and made a scene. So LAPD was called, but nothing was done. No charges were filed. Now, obviously, we're leading up to what everybody knows was
a horrific
crime.
Horrific crime.
Now, the night in question, OJ was reputed to be going to Chicago for, I think it was a photo shoot, and he had an ad to do. Nicole's house was discovered. She was discovered at her house. Mutilated, stabbed, throat slit, and just completely thrashed, neck almost broken. And then Ron Goldman, a waiter at a local restaurant, was also found on the premises, same inflicted wounds, stabbed multiple times, deep stab wounds. They said could not have been done by anybody less than over 6 foot, 200 pounds. And I mean, we're talking about somebody with the amount of force to generate stab wounds deep enough to penetrate bone, flesh, hit vital organs without problems here. And everybody who's seen movies will tell you that's the easiest thing on earth to do. We're all Game of Thrones fans here, but that actually requires a little bit of force.
A lot of strength, and for murders that happen by stabbing, also by strangulation, they always report that those are the most personal crimes. Most often, if you're attacked by a stranger, they're not going to be using that kind of force. It's a very personal thing to stab someone, very personal thing to choke someone, cut their throat. That's a very personal attack. It's malice, it's anger, it's hate, it takes a lot, and it takes some strength to really, inflict pain with a knife, as simple as it may seem to cut someone with a knife, because, you can nick yourself with a butter knife, really. It takes a lot of strength, and, you have to think this is a living, breathing human being. They're not just going to sit down while this happens.
Absolutely.
So there was definitely the person in question who did these crimes most definitely outweighed and was larger than Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman.
Definitely a brutal case. Nicole was found with multiple stab wounds in the head and neck area. One of the officers found what was one of the biggest pieces of evidence in the trial, the bloody glove.
Yes. And a lot of physical evidence, of course, the glove being one of the most...
Infamous.
Yeah, infamous, and probably what should have been damning pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
But that including a blood trail going from Rockingham, which was Nicole Brown's house, all the way back to OJ's house in Brentwood, from her home around the back to where the white Bronco was allegedly parked in the Bronco, and then back to OJ's house. There was
Wait,
a
his
blood
car
trail.
was there?
They allegedly, yes.
I didn't know that piece of information.
Yeah, there was a white truck. A witness saw parked around the side of the building complex. There's an alley that cut through the side, and you could access that by hopping a fence, and that's what they believe OJ did. And also, I'd like to just take a side note here, just to recommend to anybody. John Ryan and I have watched them both. Two really great summarizations of this case were just done recently in the last 2 years. One was by the network FX, was obviously fictitious, but it was based in reality. O.J. Simpson, The People versus O.J. Simpson.
That was a great show. Great
Cuba
acting.
played O.J.
Yes.
John
so
Travolta.
Good. Yeah. Good
Sarah
cast.
Paulson.
And I think they did it in such a way that, like I said, wasn't blasphemous to the people that were affected.
Absolutely not.
David Schwimmer played Rob Kardashian.
Although I do believe I remember hearing that the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman weren't actually contacted for that, and they were a little bit upset about that. I remember reading that somewhere. I don't know if that was ever rectified or not. I also was reading something on ABC News, actually just now, I pulled it up, and it was talking about how Kris Jenner, who was a really good friend of both OJ and Nicole Brown Simpson, how she, during the trials, it was reported by ABC News, had to listen to a 911 call. Now, it doesn't specify when this was, if it was the day of the murder or if it was, days prior, but it was before this murder took place. And it said, and I quote, "She claimed OJ is going nuts, quote unquote, and is going to beat the shit out of me," excuse my French. Her voice pleading for someone to come to her house because she thought he was going to beat the shit out of her. I think that was shocking to me because I had never heard that before. So I know I've seen Kris Jenner speak very rarely in interviews regarding this case. It was one of her dear friends, so it's heartbreaking to hear, but it does sound like, she does feel a little bit of guilt for not trying to pull Nicole out of that situation earlier. Never is anyone else to blame. No one's to blame here. It's a horrible crime, but it is interesting to hear from her friends and family who do feel a little bit of personal responsibility. I would feel the same way. If someone I knew and loved got viciously attacked or murdered,
right,
I'd feel a sense of responsibility even if I had no idea.
Absolutely.
And I feel horrible, but that's just the way it is, being a human being with emotions.
And you see how this case is still relevant in pop culture now, even. I mean, just to see that right there, a prominent figure such as Kris Jenner being, still asked about this, affected by this, and having people, I'm sure, associate her. Obviously, she's done a lot with her life, but I'm sure she's still associated to some degree with this. But then I also wanted to mention the other great informational, much more information documentary based, I think it was 8 hours long, OJ
Made in America.
Made in America.
I saw
Thank
parts
you.
of that.
OJ Made in
It's
America.
a 5-part series on ESPN.
Yes.
With a lot of videotapes from the trial.
Yes.
And
Videotapes, actual interviews with people that were involved. So, I mean, that's where a lot of this information that we got, a lot of great content came from. We did a lot of intensive background research just from watching that, doing a little bit of Googling, obviously, but from really getting in depth, I mean, they did a great job. It's produced by Jonathan Hawk, one of the best in the business, a guy I really admire. So we're talking about a few people here that have, in just recent history, taken the opportunity to talk more about this case, to bring it up. Obviously, this trial was televised. It was one of the most broadcast and publicly viewed cases in history.
It's been considered the most publicized case of all time.
Of all time, exactly, yes. And a lot of people, like we say, still want to talk about it because that first trial, there was a lot of controversy going on. Like we were saying, in Los Angeles at the time, a lot of racial division. The Rodney King beating had happened shortly before this, within 2 years before this. That was another obvious miscarriage of justice in that department. And I think a lot of people out there still had some sore lingering effects from that. The black community especially, they had a lot to deal with just systemic racism in the police department. And then we still hear about cases nowadays of people who have been mistreated, and hopefully, there will be improvements, and there have obviously been some improvements, but since the O.J. Simpson case, there has been a clear lack of association with the right way of doing things and the wrong way of doing things, I think. We can get more into that with policing, but I just mean as far as sentencing with trial goes, I mean, there have been so many people that have wondered how this type of miscarriage of justice could happen, and, like I say, I hate to associate it with karma or bad feelings being spread in a community going around and that leading back to a biased jury, because we like to think in a 12-person partisan jury system everybody has their fair say, and we'd like to think that everybody's gonna get a chance.
It's just, that's always been one of the questions I've always had with trials. It's lawyers always work to pick the jury, have the jury selection be most fair, but they do get to pick their jury, and you have to wonder, there has to be some kind of systematic way they choose. I mean, I know there's a whole process in choosing.
The voir dire process, the voir dire process is actually...
but it's like, how do you completely eliminate bias, especially in high-profile cases? And we'll get into that more with the second trial that he had.
Absolutely.
I thought another point of this case that was interesting was OJ's dog. They believe that the dog actually led them to the murder scene. I'm reading here in Time wrote an article that's really, really interesting. You should look it up if you are interested in this case at all. It's called O.J. Simpson, ... If Only the Dog Could Talk. And basically the whole thing talks about how their Akita dog named Kato, it's K-A-T-O, how would you say that? Kato. Between 10:15 and 11 p.m., the night of the murders, their dog was barking, and they saw the dog. And the dog actually had blood on its paws. One of their neighbors, Stephen Schwab, said that while walking his dog at 10:55 p.m., he came across the Akita, which had bloody paws. As Schwab headed home, the dog followed him, and he said it would howl at every house we passed, but it would stop and bark down the path. This path, we would later learn, would be where the bodies would be discovered of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. I just thought that was so interesting, because they have that instinct, and people believe this dog witnessed. Well, obviously it had bloody paw prints.
Well, there were children in the house too that night. That's another thing. Both of their children were home that night, the night she was murdered. They were asleep upstairs.
That's horrifying.
Since this was late at night, but yeah, it was. It's pretty horrifying. But that is a really interesting bit of information, Lisa.
Yeah, to your point, Lisa, that's interesting. I never heard that before. But the beginning of FX series,
People versus O.J.
Yeah, the People versus O.J. Exactly. There is a dog. That's how the pilot episode starts. There's a dog at the beginning, and if I can remember, I believe it is an Akita.
Yeah.
And you can hear it barking. I never
it was
understood
a big part
the
of the
reasoning
trial.
behind that, but yeah, that's interesting.
It was funny because, obviously dogs can't talk. It can't say what it saw, but clearly it saw something. Clearly it was alerted. Its instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. It needed to help its owners. And I think
we
that's
have to
just
think
so
that dog was
interesting.
also willing to not attack whoever was there.
You're right. Ew, I didn't think about
isn't that a little bit disconcerting, unnerving to think that dog wasn't threatened by whoever was initially there.
And that's a huge point to make. That is a huge point, because clearly,
Now, we can get in, and we will get into a little bit of our opinions, obviously, about what happened here, but just to tell you a little bit, I do want to talk about what actually the sentencing came down to. Now, the case itself was tried in Los Angeles County. Judge Ito presided, a Korean-American judge. I'm not going to say it was done for a reason, but I think that was the best way to prove no bias by the California court system.
Especially because of the trying times, as you've mentioned a few times, between races.
We talked about, the racial disparity that was going on, and I think a lot of people wanted to see what would have been a fair judge. So O.J. was initially charged with 2 counts of murder for Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. DNA was the basis for the case, obviously. That was their big linchpin. The case was prosecuted by Marcia Clark, who was actually a really successful female district attorney in L.A. And at the time, she was considered to be one of the better litigators in the area, from what I understand, from a little bit of the background reading that I did. And then they brought on Chris Darden as an assistant co-counsel. But there were 3 prosecuting attorneys, and then O.J. compiled what is now known as the Dream Team to assist in his defense, led by...
Robert Shapiro.
At first, yes, Robert Shapiro. I was just going to say some of the finest litigators after Robert Shapiro.
He pretty much relinquished all of his power.
Exactly. To some of the best trial attorneys of the last, no doubt, century. F. Lee Bailey was part of the team, and then obviously the lead attorney, who everybody now knows as being the famous Johnny Cochran. Mm-hmm. If you ever in trouble, call Johnny. Rest in peace. Rest in peace to Johnny, one of the great litigators, trial attorneys of all time. And I honestly think, and there were others involved as well. Barry Scheck.
Robert Kardashian.
Robert Kardashian was sat on counsel, and then
which was dramatic because, as I said, his ex-wife Kris Kardashian
was friends with Nicole
really
Brown,
good friends with Nicole Brown, and he was really good friends with OJ. It was I think that's why she got so much media attention during the trial, because she was basically on both sides of it. The victim was one of her best friends, whereas her ex-husband's defending the person accused of murdering her best friend. That must be the craziest position to be put in.
Had to be interesting for her.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why Robert Kardashian ended up kind of taking a backseat role in the trial. Obviously, there were a lot of other famous litigators involved as well, but as the trial went on, he kind of distanced himself, and part of that obviously could have been his own personal opinion of the case, obviously being friends with OJ.
Some personal guilt, maybe.
Exactly.
Absolutely. So OJ, as we said, he had several great litigators. Johnny Cochran brought in some of his own top lawyers, Harry Douglas from the Cochran firm, to assist in the case. And they all sort of compiled this defense that OJ could not have possibly done this based on the evidence that they had collected. The DNA evidence was all very sparse. And this was, keep in mind, DNA, we all look at DNA now as being, lock and key, close the door shut, it's absolute. This was a new technology and new science for a lot of people back then, guys. So keep in mind, this was enough to cause reasonable doubt in a jury, and that's really all it takes to acquit. We're looking just for some way to say, hey, this might have been a little off kilter here, and they did a great job, the defense, of painting a picture that perhaps OJ was a victim himself. He was obviously a prominent actor, prominent athlete, and people wanted to, bring him down a little bit, especially the LAPD, the vindictive Los Angeles Police Department, who had seen a black man rise to power, rise to prominence, and now, they want to get him back a little bit. And you know what? That wasn't the craziest defense to spin, guys. That
absolutely not.
That played pretty well with this jury, and
yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like, not only did the evidence make me feel a little bit different, which we'll talk about, but Miss White Bronco chase, it's if you have nothing to hide, you hide nothing,
right?
And it felt like during this entire trial, everything that OJ did was hiding something.
Yes.
And so that's why it's just mind-boggling, which is why this is the first case we wanted to do, how it all played out.
Right.
And we'll talk about his second trial coming up here and the verdict of his first trial, but it's just something I wanted to touch on. It's, if you have nothing to hide, you hide nothing.
Right. And the controversy that's associated to this case to this day is, even though ultimately, we know he was acquitted, but with the amount of evidence and the brutality associated with the murders and the evidence of domestic abuse that had been played out, and then there was this idea that OJ had also, like you said, Lisa, had no reason to hide anything, and yet the whole time he's trying to change up his story and say, you know, we were great, things were good, but then, oh, well, we weren't, you know, we weren't speaking.
And didn't he threaten suicide in his Bronco chase? Like, at the end of it, he was saying he wanted to kill himself.
Yeah, the whole time he was holding a gun.
And I don't think that's because he was innocent and just worried that it was going to fall down on him. I don't think that's the case at all. That had something to do with, one, I honestly think it was kind of like a media ploy. Like, he wanted people to feel sorry for him. Oh, I'm so sad.
Yeah.
I don't want to live without her. But at the same time, I see it as guilt.
I think a lot of people had that shared opinion with you, Lisa. I think a lot of people kind of saw this as yet another grab for attention from O.J. Simpson, a guy who had perfected the art of finding his way into the media. And, you know, I personally, I like to play devil's advocate. Anybody that knows you, and you guys, if you listen to more podcasts with us,
that's what this is about.
Yeah, I like to spit out that here. I think OJ really was conflicted. I am of the opinion, and obviously we'll give our opinions here on what we think happened, but I am of the opinion that, at least for the purpose of trial, I think OJ was, that he really didn't think he was culpable for this. I think he might have known that he did something wrong, but I don't think he thought he was culpable.
I feel like even to this day, he's convinced himself that he's done nothing wrong.
He's done nothing wrong. And I think that's part of, you know, the Bronco chase and part of the trial of the century and having the whole media coverage be insistent and, you know, everything that took place within the trial. There were a lot of very odd inconsistencies. You know, one thing that I always like to think about is, you know, they had the entire jury, 12 jurors and a judge and 2 prosecuting district attorneys, and then an entire defense team and a defendant go to one of the crime scenes, take tours of the crime scene. And, you know, that's almost unprecedented. If that was anybody else, are we talking about anything that ever happening? You know, not only we leave the court setting, but we're going to take a little tour around Los Angeles here and check out.
I've never even heard of that in any other case.
Yeah,
now
never.
that I'm thinking about it.
I don't think anybody would ever say that that's happened.
Pictures, maybe, not like, let's get on a school bus, let's go take a tour.
And then there was the whole idea that, you know, the defense team changed OJ's house around John Ryan, and I always laugh about that, you know, they made it seem like he was a big family man, and that they hung African posters and African decorations in his house ridiculous. To make him seem like more of a likable black man in the community that he was trying to defend himself in. And now I do want to point out to you guys here, this jury was comprised of, I believe it was 5 women, 7 men.
6 African Americans.
6 African Americans in LA County. So we're talking about a jury pool here that, if they're not sympathetic necessarily to O.J. Simpson as a murderer, I don't think that's what anybody here would imply. And a lot of people have said, you know, that the jury selection and the voir dire and what took place with trying to have it moved to a different county, I think they tried to move to Santa Monica.
But you have to think, and to put things into perspective, this was Juice, this was OJ. For people of LA, this was
hero,
the football player, this was the Heisman Trophy winner, NFL MVP. This was the man. He was on TV everywhere. Hertz commercials.
There has to be bias.
Yeah,
there has to be bias.
And you wonder where that played in with the trial. Obviously, we think it did. All of us are of shared opinion that had some mitigating factor on this. I mean,
I think one of the most noteworthy things about this trial, and it was really revolutionary, was with all the DNA evidence, there was still reasonable doubt. It was 22 years ago now, and as we discuss it, so much has changed. Police protocol has changed. How they study the DNA evidence.
How it's
I'm sure this case led that.
If the case happened today, what would the trial result be? What would the verdict be?
Absolutely, and you have to wonder. You have to wonder with even today's media celebrity. I mean, we've seen a lot of athletes been prosecuted. Not all of them have been necessarily convicted, but we've seen,
which we'll get into at the end of this.
We will talk about.
I have strong feelings about that.
Right now, that celebrity status has something to do with, you know, what happened here. I think OJ was probably the prime case of that. You know, this is a guy who, like John Ryan said, he's the juice, man. Everybody wants OJ in the room, and not only was he famous, he was well known to be a schmoozer, and, you know, he got along well with everybody, and
he was captivating.
He worked the room like as well as anybody ever.
You know what they say though, sociopaths, their personalities are A1.
And I think that's exactly what we were dealing with here, Lisa. I'm, you know, obviously I'm no expert. I'm no criminal diagnosis. I couldn't exactly.
We're not psychologists here. We're not.
Point out, guys, nobody here is a psychologist. We don't have any degrees in anything like that.
Just opinions. So don't get your panties in a bunch.
And anybody, you can look this up on, med journals, what the definition of a psychopath and sociopath is. But you're right, absolutely.
That's one of the key
sociopath
factors.
is someone who can among a group of people, feel no empathy and maintain their composure, even having done terrible things.
Well, Matt, how did this trial turn out, the first trial?
So let's talk about this here.
Woo! It's a doozy.
We've done everything leading up to the trial. I think we've talked about a little bit in some way or another, the background. So obviously, like I said, O.J. was charged with 2 counts of murder. The case was based strongly in the DNA evidence. That was what Marcia Clark and Chris Darden continued to hit home with. Obviously, the defense tried to pull that away by pulling out the distrust of police, making that be the highlight of the case. Everybody who had any encounters with the police could have told you that they were a problem. They made it seem as though the brutality of the case was more overshadowed by the fact that this evidence wasn't really convincing. We don't have anything to say for certain that this was any eyewitnesses, basically. We don't have any video evidence. We don't have anything convincing.
The only eyewitness they had was a dog.
A dog, right, who we wish could have said something for all our sakes. But this case ended up going to the jury after several weeks of having been battled out. Both the defense and the prosecutorial team put together really detailed cases. Both had experts come in. Both had crying moms on the stand. I mean, the whole shebang. This was televised, so you guys have to imagine they were going for dramatic effect here. Probably one of the most was the glove not fitting. If it does not fit, you must acquit. Where they actually made O.J. stand up in court, try on the glove that was found at the crime scene. It did not fit his hand. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute as well. Obviously, that we think might have had something to do with a little bit of trickery. Also, a little bit of just misplayed on the trial side. Not great litigation by the prosecuting team here, Chris Darden. Yeah, honestly, and anybody who's ever studied...
She got a lot of shit for it, too. Being a woman during this trial.
Both those two people really endured a lot. They really did. Single mom and Chris Darden being a black man, a lot of people thought he was a proxy.
And people were pulling her apart in the media for the way she looked, like it was not about her at all, and people were tearing her down.
It was ugly. It got ugly. This was, like we said, the most televised trial.
Criticized her hairstyles, wardrobe.
Everything you could imagine. I mean, this was hell for a lot of people, guys. I think that goes without saying. So what it comes down to, this case eventually, like we said, it went to a jury. After all of this time having been in court and all the witnesses, all the evidence that was presented, they were only deliberated in there for 3.5 hours, guys. That's like what we looked forward to from morning till lunch. It's like the morning.
I can't even go that long without thinking of food or sleep.
I want a snack in that time, but other than that, I'm good. We could. That's watching Lord of the Rings, basically. They watched Lord of the Rings in there, and then they decided the trial of the century. Yeah. And typically jury deliberations, anybody,
what was the sentence he was at? Life in prison or death?
He was looking at life in prison, yes. There was no death penalty statute for this, even though I think mitigating factors would have found that to be, if there was a death penalty in California at the time. But no, he was going to be sentenced to life in prison for 2 counts of murder, but he was acquitted. There were no lesser known sentences that were allowed to be considered, which is also something that we think might have been one mitigating factor that I'll mention, at least I think. And what that means for those of you guys who don't know a little bit of legal jargon, considering lesser known sentences would be that if he was to be found by the jury to be responsible, but not necessarily responsible for the crime that he was charged with. So in this case, he was charged with murder. If they wanted to charge him with something lesser, such as manslaughter, to say that he didn't plan it, didn't have it all in mind, and he just happened to kill her in a fit of rage. So that was not actually allowed in this trial. They went for it all.
And that's an interesting thing in a lot of cases.
It is.
I think we'll talk about it later with different cases, because I know of another very popular case, which we'll get into later. I think this person got off because of what they were trying to charge her with.
Right. And Lisa and I, we've talked about prosecutorial discretion as well as being a big factor in sentencing, and that's what we want to focus on, obviously, with this podcast, is to talk about the sentencing. So, and prosecutorial discretion is just to say that the ultimate decision for how sentencing goes. If they want to choose to indict for murder or manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter, however they decide to go to the grand jury with it beforehand, is all up to the prosecution. So we think with this case that definitely had something to do with how it ended up playing out, because after only that 3.5 hour span, the jury came back with not guilty verdicts on both murder counts, of his own recognizance after that.
To kind of touch on a few things here that really exemplify the magnitude of the case. So basically it was on October 2nd, 1995, when the jury reached their first deliberation after 4 hours, but it wasn't until the next morning when Judge Ito postponed the announcement until the following morning. So it was about 10 a.m. Pacific time on the 3rd when the verdict was announced. And just a couple points here that I was reading. So before the verdict, President Bill Clinton was briefed on security measures if rioting occurred nationwide. Obviously, we'll touch on that in a second. But an estimated 100 million people worldwide watched or listened to the verdict announcement.
Wow.
Long-distance telephone call volume declined by 58%, and trading volume on the New York Stock Exchange decreased by 41%. Wow. So much work stopped that the verdict cost an estimated $480 million in lost productivity.
Wow.
For that moment. People avoided going to the bathrooms.
Yeah. Wow.
This was a huge
If
trial.
that doesn't tell you guys what it is that we were dealing with here in significance, as far as who was on trial and what it meant when it would be decided, I don't think anything will.
Do we know, if there was a survey done, amongst, the general population, whether or not they believed OJ was guilty or innocent? Or is it just now looking back on it?
No, Lisa, I'm glad you brought that up. That first case, actually, now obviously I want to point out there was a survey done, a Gallup poll. There were multiple done, and there were different... different strokes for different folks, whatever people had.
Yes.
Some of the backgrounds that people came from, you're either urban or rural, obviously black and white, obviously socioeconomics had something to do with it, obviously women and men. You're talking about some sports fans and not. There were people who had, no idea who O.J. Simpson was, including Marcia Clark, one of my favorite parts of O.J. Made in America, the ESPN documentary, is where Marcia Clark just discloses that she didn't know who O.J. Simpson was before he came up on the docket sheet. He was just the guy. He was on, that guy from Sports Center.
Little did she know, it thrust her into the spotlight.
Of course, and this is the case that
trial
would end up making her career, quote unquote. And, I think really what we find now is, like Lisa, you said, what would it be like today? This case, I think, would be so much different.
I agree.
With a lot of what's happened since then as far as DNA evidence has progressed.
Yeah, you touched on that earlier, and I think you're 100% correct. Right. I think John Ryan and, you did too, Matt, hit on, it's without a reasonable doubt. Yep. And that's the hardest thing for these trials because, it is such a task. If there's any shed of doubt, then what the jurors are supposed to listen to.
Right.
If there's, innocent till proven guilty, if you can put any light of innocence, any doubt that this person could commit the crime, it throws the entire trial for a loop. And I think that was one of the most frustrating parts of this case for me because in my mind, I'm seeing all the evidence, looking back on it now, with all of the information out now about the case, and I'm thinking, how did they have any doubt? But there was.
One of the jurors actually said, Lisa, in an interview, and I thought this was another really interesting tidbit. She said, I think there was evidence to show that she was abused, and they didn't prove it. I think there was evidence to show that
they fell short.
Right, that they may not have lived up to what the prosecutorial... Their entire duty is to prove their case.
And I guess it is hard, is that, like you said, you're up against a superstar, an American hero.
It is, and his relevance has a lot to do with it. I also think, and even what she said that I thought rung really true, is they didn't get it over the goal line. They made a lot of points that nobody could refute.
Yeah, a few jurors, even after the trial, wrote a book, Madam Forum it was called, where they kind of described how race that led to their decision, but they found that there were police errors.
And I think Mark Furman being a key witness, and we have not actually mentioned this name yet, but for those of you guys that don't know, Mark Furman was actually the detective who found the bloody glove in the alleyway that was one of the most damning pieces of evidence. But he was a well-known, reputed racist. I mean, this was a blatant, out there, everybody had heard him talk about it before, and he had supposedly, changed his opinions and
changed his tune
his
conveniently.
life had turned around. Good for you, bro.
Yeah.
But, at this point in time, I don't understand how the prosecutors could have looked at this guy. How did the district attorneys not look at this guy and really vet him and say, hey, we need a guy up here who's not going to have any holes. And there were a lot of holes that they were able to poke in his defense. And I would encourage anybody to go and check out some of the video of his testimony.
Witness stand.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
You're reminded, sir, that you are still under oath. Mr. Ullman, you may proceed.
Was the testimony that you gave in this case completely truthful?
I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
Have you ever falsified a police report?
I wish to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
Is it your intention to assert your Fifth Amendment privilege with respect to all questions that I ask you?
Yes.
I only have one other question.
What was that, Mr. Ullman?
Detective Furman, did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?
I assert my Fifth Amendment privilege.
There's some really interesting pieces there that show where I think just why this happened. I'll list my three biggest reasons. I'll say number one would be the prosecutors falling short of their job. They're supposed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. There should be no way that anybody else could have done it. They did not do that. Number two, I will say it was a mishandling to some degree by the LAPD. I think, and not just the way they allowed OJ to turn himself in, but he didn't. He
on
left
top of the
precinct.
lack of trust for the LAPD at
right.
the time.
Yeah, and you got to think that's exactly a great point, John Ryan. There is a lot of distrust for LAPD at the time,
especially between races.
Exactly, between the black community and the LAPD especially, and they want people to think that we're dealing with, O.J. Simpson. He's, like we said, a hero. He's a guy that everybody wants to believe couldn't be at fault here. We'd much rather believe it's the institutional racism that we've been dealing with and been seeing for years in the community. And then number three, I will put as I think was OJ's defense team was stellar.
Phenomenal.
Johnny Cochran, I will never stop admiring that man's ability to
Let's
litigate.
just say if you murder someone, get them on your side.
Yeah, you know who to call, unfortunately. Now some of the surviving attorneys from that team have said, that they had a lot of great exposure from that. They learned a lot from it. It was also one of the more trying times of their lives because a lot of
backlash, I'm sure now.
A lot of backlash. I'm sure they still deal with.
So what did he do in between trial number 1 and trial number 2?
Lay
low?
So then there was a little bit after OJ was acquitted here. We'll move on. And now there's always been some speculation. OJ kind of lived in the shadows for a while because he thought a lot of people weren't really too favorable of him.
I don't doubt that.
Touch-ups with the legal system, though. He was arrested in Florida for wakes and manatee safety zones.
Something minor in Florida, like a trespassing.
He just can't say. It seems like he's one of those people that, however minor, can't stay out of the spotlight.
Yeah, it's very...
he had his football fame. Then when that was starting to dwindle a bit, had this crazy trial. Then when he became one of the most hated people, probably, I'd argue, in America.
I'd say for sure, after this happened,
he brought it up again.
That's a good point, Lisa. I mean, this guy, I don't like to use the term attention whore until it's appropriate, but it's appropriate. Yeah, he's an attention whore.
I
mean, I think, this is the type of guy who had lived in the spotlight his whole life. And
stand to not be the center of attention.
And he wanted to be. I don't think he wanted to be a murderer, but I think he
at
wanted
this
to
point,
be...
though, he doesn't care. Because he's already become one of the most hated people. So now it's like, fuck it, let's be famous for anything.
Yeah, any press is good press at that point, I guess. So, OJ spent a couple years, and now there are some accounts from friends that talk a little bit about, what he did. He wrote a book, essentially, I don't want to say confessing. It was literally called
If I Did It.
Yeah, but he said, if I did it, so that right there is a little bit
Matt,
hinky.
I pulled up a excerpt thing from this. So I was actually listening, because like Matt said, OJ's back in spotlight because he's up for his parole hearing tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of this stuff is becoming refreshed, for the generations, my age who were too young and maybe didn't really follow crime, they're bringing it all back up. And so OJ he had a ghostwriter apparently. He helped a ghostwriter write a book called If I Did It. Now, there was major backlash, obviously, because that's insane for someone, not convicted, but, acquitted of murder, to write a book on essentially how he would do it. So what happened was...
One of the disturbing things about the book cover, too, is it's in big letters, I did it, and if is real small before it.
It's disturbing all around, but the crazy thing is, and I actually find this super interesting, obviously there was major backlash when people heard that OJ was behind a book coming out about the crime and about the case called If I Did It. And so actually the Goldmans, Ron Goldman's family, bought the rights to the book.
Mm-hmm.
And so they added excerpts of them and their family speaking of Ron and of Nicole Brown and their thoughts and feelings on the case, while leaving in, what OJ had written, so they would get the rights to that book, get the royalties for the book.
I'm glad you mentioned the Goldmans as well. Go ahead, John.
I kind of want to touch on that as well. So after the murder case, there was a civil lawsuit involving the Goldman family, which OJ was convicted and had to pay the Goldmans $33 million of wrongful death.
Now, for those of you guys that don't know, a little bit of background, a little difference here between what a civil case and a criminal case is. A criminal case, as we were talking about, has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. So there can be no evidence, or there can be no doubt of anything once the evidence has been presented.
One juror has reasonable doubt, not guilty.
It's not guilty,
Wait,
exactly.
Is
so
that
they have
really
to
how
convince,
that works?
Yeah, it's not
by
by majority.
You would think I'd know this after researching so many crimes.
It's all 12 jurors, all 12 jurors.
To a civil trial where it's
just
majority.
And it's what's called the term is the preponderance of the evidence, which is just to show that there is enough evidence to show that he could have committed the crime, that he was guilty of it. So he was convicted in that civil. And it's not called convicted.
Did those ever result in jail time civil cases?
No, it's not anything to do with the court system.
Monetary?
It's a monetary or it's some type of reparation.
Well, at the time for OJ, $33 million of money he didn't have. He just paid for the legal team of the century.
Yeah. Is that partially why they got the royalties to the book? Because that was to pay off.
Exactly.
That's what it was. Exactly.
They also tried to collect his NFL pension, which I think they failed in doing so. But they literally tried to destroy his life.
See,
in
that's
a way
the
they
crazy
did.
thing, because when you would think, I mean, I guess it's kind of like the lottery. Like when you win $10 million, you don't really walk away with $10 million. There's taxes. Is that the same thing with civil cases when there is this crazy? Because I know in lesser high-profile cases, the ones that are lesser known, when there's crazy abundance of money owed, I've seen it where they're never given. The victims' families are never given, never see a dime of that money.
That's exactly what happened in this case, Lisa. Because OJ did not have the funds to pay back that $33 million, they were not given nearly a fraction.
So would that be considered a win? Like, yes, he got convicted, but...
Well, that's what you got to ask yourself. I think Ron Goldman's family would say... And his dad, actually, very well spoken with the media is the term I'm looking for. He's a very public figure now. And he's done a pretty interesting job of keeping this going, that, not only he thinks that O.J. Simpson was guilty of killing his son, but that he feels that he's still responsible and owes a debt to society for it.
O.J. eventually sold his Heisman Trophy to pay the Goldman family and ended up making about half...
so is there any consequence if you don't pay that off, or is it just like pay it off when you can, like student loans, like, you know, chip away at the old block?
I couldn't tell you exactly. I feel
you
like
have a legal right to pay for those damages before providing. You basically pay for your necessities, but anything else
goes to that.
Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So I want to move on a little bit from this and talk about what happened next.
And what the parole hearing's for tomorrow.
Segue into that, yeah. So we're talking a little bit about OJ being up for parole now. We're talking a little bit about him just most recently being hard up for cash, having to pay the Goldmans, obviously after the whole trial and having the civil case and having all the backlash from that going along with it. OJ was pretty hard up for money at this point. This was the mid-2000s. You know, he was still doing appearances on, you know, Howard Stern and having his here and there appearances and making his Wendy Williams show type of... And, you know, you'd see him pop up, but he wasn't really getting much attention, and he was obviously taken away from what had made him famous in football, his career as an athlete and his career as a broadcaster. So he's pretty hard up for cash. And a friend of his, he found out, named Bruce Fromong. I guess you could say they were associates. They had dealt in the past for some of the memorabilia that OJ had collected over the years. Trophies or jerseys or game balls, things that are of obvious monetary value.
Do you think they're worth more now that he's infamous or before when he was famous? Because infamy, for those who don't know, is when you're known for something negative, something horrible, but really well known for it. But being famous, obviously, is a little bit of a different ballpark. So do you think these items are worth more now because OJ is known everywhere, not just to the sports community? Or do you think it doesn't?
I would think so. I would think, honestly, that would contribute some for the people who are collectors to have some of the more important memorabilia pieces to not only collect as, like you said, sports figure, but you're talking about trial of the century now. You know, this is historically significant artifacts as well. So this was, I think OJ would have described it as a misunderstanding, and I think Bruce Fromong would have described it as an assault.
He did not describe it as a...
So they met...
I liked how you put that out there.
They met that a little differently there. So they met up in Las Vegas. This was at a hotel at a convention.
I was just about this today.
Yeah, OJ heard from another associate that this guy had several items of his that were of high value, that he was really
what's the term for what he did? He was a collector, like a trader.
It's called a fence, is what it's called, where you collect artifacts and then you peddle them to people.
For moolah.
For moolah, exactly. So they be properly acquired. But Fromong was not a shady character, but he'd had some shady dealings himself. OJ and a group of friends, what they allegedly did was they heard that this guy was in a hotel, and they kind of got it in their minds that they were going to go over there, and they were going to keep him in this room until he gave him his stuff back. So they went in, they kicked in the door, and at gunpoint...
Two of them had guns,
correct. Is heard on tape as saying... No one leaves this room. Now that comes in significantly later, but OJ then kind of roughed the guy up, told him a little bit about, I'm OJ, who do you think I am, or who do you think you are?
He was yelling profanities.
Yeah, yelling some really awful things at this guy, and then took a few of the items with him, a few jerseys, and left. And then 3 days later was picked up by Vegas PD and held without bail, remanded.
Right after this whole ordeal happened, the guys, I don't remember their names, Matt can correct me in a minute here, but the guys who were held at gunpoint, with these two guns roughed up a bit, and who had OJ's merch, which is kind of ironic, stolen from them, they immediately identified OJ as a suspect. They said, OJ Simpson just came in here and robbed me at gunpoint. And straight up, straightforward, there was no questions asked. It was O.J. Simpson and friends, and team. And I think that, I was listening to another good podcast, which I'll plug here. It's called Court Junkie, and she just covered this case because the trial or the parole hearing's coming up tomorrow, and she plays actual files, and I'll see if I can insert some in this podcast just so you guys can get a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about here. But basically, a police officer didn't believe them when they called this into the police, because you're hearing O.J. Simpson just robbed people for O.J.'s own stuff at gunpoint.
Right.
That sounds like, too stupid, for lack of a better term, to be true.
Right. Almost like, it was like a joke, yeah.
I hold you up hostage because you have a pencil of mine. Obviously, there was more value to the items that these, gentlemen had. However, it's just moronic. Instead of saying, hey, those are my things, can I have them back?
You got away with murder.
Yeah, right?
So you do something this stupid. It's just, and the police officer straight up said, this was shocking. I didn't believe it. I didn't think that was legit. Our home team just scored.
Buccos just got a big victory.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. We'll edit this out later, but the Pirates just won.
Yes.
Sean Ryan, at least.
We had to
Listen
plug
back
it in
on
there.
this in December, and we didn't make the playoffs. We'll feel stupid.
Oh, man.
We had to plug that in there because
Sorry,
we're
guys.
watching that.
Okay,
currently.
but I do want to point out now a significant piece of information here. This guy, Bruce Fromong, had permits and licenses and all the merchandise to have all these. He had all the tags. So this guy was legit. I mean, it's not like he stole this stuff, even though that's what OJ was claiming. That became a big thing at the trial. So, as we said, he was arrested 3 days later, and he was eventually charged, he was remanded, first of all, charged with, ready for this, kidnapping with a deadly weapon, robbery with a deadly weapon, assault with a deadly weapon. All these are Class B or A felonies, by the way, guys. So you're looking at serious time here for any one of these convictions.
And in OJ's mind, he just went in, showed a gun, and said, hey, give me my shit back.
He didn't even consider it stealing. He was taking his things back from someone else. Right. So that was his primary defense at the time. And keep in mind, Johnny Cochran was not his attorney here.
Wouldn't he be so lucky?
Wouldn't he be lucky, yes. Now, he was charged with all these counts here, and really what a lot of people wondered was how many of these are not trudged up, but are exaggerated somewhat just based on what OJ did in the past. Mm-hmm. We're looking at 13 years later here. How much of this is related to that old case? How much
and that's what we were talking about earlier with the point of the jury selection process, the voir dire process. Is that how you pronounce it?
Voir dire.
Voir dire.
Voir dire, yeah.
Excuse me, French. Is that French?
Voir dire.
Voir dire. Yes. Voir
yeah,
dire.
I did actually.
Voir
I took a
dire.
criminal justice class, so I know a little bit of this stuff. And like I said, I researched this for my fun and before bed, all that great stuff. But it begs the question: there is no way that this jury came in with a clean slate. No way. There's no way. Yeah. This was one of this is still one of the most infamous trials.
Right.
Of my whole lifetime. I'm 24 years old. You ask anyone in my generation who's O.J. Simpson, this is the trial. It's not even, he's the best football player. It's this trial. This is what he's now known for.
So we're not going to say we don't feel bad for O.J. here, I guess.
No.
I don't, at least personally. But I will say, and Lisa made a great point in saying, there was a bias here coming in.
People wanted him to serve for a crime he committed
at some point in time. This was
that we believe
he committed. Yes, innocent until proven guilty, guys. Please remember.
If
we have
I did
opinions.
it, but I didn't.
we have our opinions, but everybody has
And I always say this is something you'll probably hear me say a lot, and it sounds horrible, and it's not word for word what it means, but I always say that I have a misplaced empathy problem. Now, I don't have any empathy for this piece of garbage, OJ, but I did listen, like I said, to Court Junkies podcast on this, and they did play, after we'll go over what the outcome of this trial was. Obviously, if he's up for parole, he did get convicted of something, which Matt will go over here in a second, but they did play OJ, what he said to the jury and to the judge before they read their conviction, and if you didn't know who OJ was, and he wasn't infamous for this crazy trial so many years ago, you'd almost feel bad for the guy because he sounded seriously like bewildered. Like, I really thought I was taking back what was mine. And right. I'm sure Matt will touch on this in a little bit, but like I said prior, we were talking about him owing the Goldmans a lot of money, millions of dollars in royalties for civil case for the crime. And he's been heard saying to other people, I believe it is on recording, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that his whole purpose in doing this was to keep those items out of, and he calls them the gold diggers, not the Goldmans, he calls them the gold diggers' hands, because he knows they want those items, or they want to profit from those items, as they had been, like you said, from, you know, or John Ryan, you said, from the Heisman Trophy. They are being paid still for the damages, which they should be. I feel like he owes his life to them, I really believe. But sorry, Matt, for interrupting, but, you know, I just thought that was so interesting that, you know,
I totally agree. I'm glad you pointed that out.
He brought that up, and that's, like I said, the misplaced empathy comes from his plea to the court before, you know, they read his sentencing to consider, and it's just interesting because obviously he didn't bring up any of that, but he did sound so convincing that he truly believed he was just taking back his own property. He claims he didn't know anyone had guns. He claims he didn't know it was going to turn into a mess. He thought he was going into his buddy's place, getting back his materials, one and done it, and go. So it's interesting. You should listen to it. And obviously I have a huge bias. You know, I think this guy's a piece of garbage. But at the end of the day, if you listen to it with an open mind, it does sound really convincing. It sounds like something that is an innocent person talking. Someone who, not innocent because he knows that, you know, he did this. There is no doubt that he went into this room and got those materials, stole them. However, he truly believed he was taking back his own property. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about this current case, is that he convinced me a little bit.
I stand before you today, sorry, somewhat confused. I feel like to the people of the state of Nevada. I've been coming to Nevada since 1959. I worked summer jobs here for my uncle in 60 and 61, and I've been coming ever since, and I've never gotten in any trouble. People have always been fine to me. When I came here for a wedding. I didn't come here to reclaim property. I was told it was here. When he told me that Monday that the stuff was in Nevada, when he knew I was going to be in Nevada, I called my kids. I talked to my sisters. I called the Brown family, and I told them I had a chance to get some of our property back. Property that over the years we've seen being sold on the internet. We've seen pictures of ours that were stolen from our home going into the tabloids. We've called the police and asked what to do. They told us what to try to do, but you can never find out who was selling it. And this was the first time I had an opportunity to catch the guys red-handed who had been stealing from my family. I knew these guys. I did think Mike Gilbert would be there, and I know, as they told me, the two guys there, that he was the one who did it. But I have no hatred for Mike Gilbert. In the past, as we know, you heard on the tape, Mike Gilbert tried to set me up in a porn video, tricked me into a room with hidden cameras, and they still wrote in the newspaper and the tabloids, they still had cover stories that OJ did it, even though there was no porn video, even though I didn't participate in it. I forgave Mike. I yelled at him, and I forgave him, just like I yelled at Bruce and Beardsley, and I've forgiven them. We've talked about it, Beardsley and I, the next day. And Bruce and I hugged and talked about it. His kids have called me since this. We've apologized to each other. The only person I requested to help me here was Mr. Stewart. I did request him. I needed his car. I asked him if he had some guys to help me remove these things from the room. I didn't ask anybody to do anything but to stand behind me, allow me to yell at these guys, and then help me remove those things. And if they wouldn't let me remove them, we would call the cops on them, because I felt that they were wrong. They had turnover orders, and they hadn't turned over some of these things that were both garnishable and things that were not garnishable. I didn't want them to yell at them. I think Mr. McClintock in a previous trial said that I didn't ask them to yell at anybody. Unfortunately, they did, and I believe it was my fault because I brought them there. And I knew the character of a couple of the guys that were there, and it was my fault that they were there. But in no way did I mean to hurt anybody, to steal anything from anyone. I spoke to Bruce before I left the room. He told me what was his, and I called him, and I got to the car and I said, exactly what do you have? I want to send it back to you. I talked to the police officers. I volunteered immediately to come back, show them what was taken, and to tell them what took place before anybody talked to the police. I was the first guy to volunteer to do it, and I heard on the tapes that they thought I was stupid for doing it. But I didn't want to steal anything from anybody. I don't think anybody there said I wanted anybody else's stuff, just my own. I wanted my daughter, Miss Brown gave her mother's wedding ring, stolen. You know, my kids who had pictures, my oldest son has his own family now. He wanted the picture in the Oval Office with Gerald Ford when he was 5 years old. Stolen. All of these things are gone. My family knew what we were doing. And I don't want to hurt Bruce. I didn't want to hurt any of these guys. I know these guys. These guys have eaten in my home. I've done book reports with their kids. I sung to their mothers when they were sick. You know, I wasn't there to hurt anybody. I just wanted my personal things. And I realized I was stupid. I am sorry. I didn't mean to steal anything from anybody. And I didn't know I was doing anything illegal. I thought I was confronting friends and retrieving my property. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. But all the other guys, except Mr. Stewart, volunteered. They wanted to go. Mr. Stewart is the only person that I asked, would he come to help me? All the rest of them, when they found out, they volunteered. Come on, let us go. One of them wanted to be the security guy. He claimed he was a security guy. But I didn't mean to hurt anybody, and I didn't mean to steal from anybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Like I said, he's a piece of garbage, but I don't know, Matt. Let us know how it turned out. What happened here?
No, I absolutely appreciate that, Lisa, because that contributes a lot to his state of mind of where he was on this before he was sentenced. And, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. I don't think he ever thought he was guilty of anything in either case. You know, in either trial he was with, it wasn't like OJ's fault almost. You kind of feel like he was deflecting the entire time, getting everyone else.
It's like he wants people to feel sorry for him.
Right. Almost like we should because he's OJ, and that's enough for him. So I think after we talk a little bit about what he was sentenced to here, you guys will understand a little bit more. He was convicted of all 10 counts. 10 different counts, as I said, 4 of which were A felony murders. So you're looking at a top count here, guys. He was finally sentenced. This is an interesting little tidbit here for you guys that love little factoids.
Oh, love them.
13 years to the day after he was acquitted of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman's murder, he was convicted of those 10 counts and sentenced to 33 years in prison on December 5th, 2008. 33 years.
Do we think that's coincidence, or did they do that on purpose?
Well, that's the next question I wanted to pose.
He's on parole for July 20th, 2017.
Yes, 9 years later.
Wait,
Now, I want to pose that question.
Day?
No.
Oh, no.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow,
said,
ironically enough.
Yeah, you just said it was December, and I asked you.
But I do want to pose to this question you just asked to you guys and to our listeners. You know, the big question here that what this podcast is based on. Was this a fair sentence? Was this what justice should be, an eye for an eye? Because ultimately, the three of us, I at least know, I think Lisa's pointed out, John Ryan has made clear to me before, and he's said to you guys, we all think OJ killed 2 people back in 1993.
I have a hard time believing people can convince someone else that he did not do it.
I agree. I think it's really too much damning evidence not to think.
It's like you guys pointed out before, and like I honestly didn't know the difference between a civil suit and a larger state criminal case. I didn't know. I know it's beyond a reasonable doubt, but I didn't realize that meant all the jurors had to agree. And I think that's a really hard thing to do. I think that's a really to get 12 people. Like I said, like we've said time and time again, he's a high-profile guy, likable guy, American hero, football star, who killed his wife, or allegedly killed his wife, and or ex-wife. Were they exes at that point?
They were estranged.
Okay, so they weren't divorced, but they were separated.
I think they were separated, yes, and were.
Sorry if we don't get this all 100%.
Yeah, we're all doing our best here, guys.
Just bear with us. But it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it's just so frustrating because I get how hard it is. It must be one of the hardest jobs in the world. My uncle's actually a defense attorney, a criminal justice lawyer, and I always ask, how do you, and I'm going to try to get him on this podcast, later down the road,
we
opinions,
definitely want to hear his opinion.
That, those years of experience and, working hand in hand in criminals who are convicted of crimes and some that he's gotten off. It's always been such an interesting question to me. Lawyers, how do you sit next to someone if you believe they did what they're convicted of? And my uncle's answer was interesting, and he can always go back and correct my words, but he said something to the point, because I asked this to him when I was like 14, because like I've said, I've been a crime junkie since I can remember, and it's always interested me. And he said, Lisa, it's not about whether or not I think they did it, it's about getting the fairest sentence for what they're accused of, getting them the fairest trial possible and the fairest outcome possible. And whether that means getting off completely depending on the evidence, that's one thing, but it's not where your personal opinions don't matter when you're a lawyer. It's your job. You're representing your client. You're pretty much the cheerleader for your client to get the fairest sentence possible.
Absolutely.
And personal opinion here, I don't believe his first trial sentence was fits the crime. I don't believe that at all. And I could talk to his defense team now. Do they? And I know they've did some interviews or wrote some articles in the past kind of detailing that they can't really go into it, but kind of hinting at what they feel. And I just think that's so interesting. He says, did he do it? Did he actually do it? Did he ever admit guilt to anyone, even though he wasn't found guilty of these crimes? And how much does this affect this new trial? And I think it has everything to do with it. I think, like I said, unless these people that they dug up from the ground, these jurors, I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean that they had to have been living under a rock if they didn't know who OJ was. And so there is absolutely, I believe in my whole heart of hearts, there is no way that that trial did not play a part in this one. And I know I was listening to that podcast earlier, and the judge actually made a speech before she convicted him and said, I told the jurors, if you're here to convict OJ for a crime he may or may not have committed so many years ago, I work for the state, I believe in the justice system. If you're here to do that, this isn't the trial for you. But there's no way that let's go around the room here. I, for one, if they asked me to be a juror on an OJ case, you better believe I would jump at it, right? Because I know who O.J. Simpson is. I know what this trial, his past trial has entailed. That's a high-profile case. Even if it was for him running a traffic light, that's going to be a high-profile case because who he is. Would you be a juror on this case, or do you think you'd have too much of a bias to be even considered? It would be hard to hide the bias, but I think that's what these people did. There's no way they didn't know, There's no way they don't have an opinion, whether good or bad, of his first trial.
The legal system wants you to believe that there's precedence, but everything ties back to former cases. Like, was OJ's first conviction, or lack of conviction, I should say, was it because of the Rodney King trial? Was it the Rodney King beating? The lack of conviction for the 4 cops at the time? And then was OJ's second time in Vegas, was that a conviction for not being...
I think that's a great point, John Ryan, especially when you talk about bringing up precedents. And I mean, we talk about precedents in the legal sense as directing what verdicts are and what sentencing should be based on precedents. But in this case, it's almost even more prevalent as just having to say, what happened in these trials before this one came up is really what led to this final verdict. I mean, this guy is serving 33 years for essentially walking in a room and taking some stuff from a guy. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, there were 2 guys with guns. Nobody had a gun shoved down their throat. Nobody was shot.
In this case, punishment definitely, in my opinion, does not fit the crime.
I would agree 100%, Lisa. And I think
it's unfair to say that his past trial, as much as we want to pretend it didn't have anything to do with it, it's unfair to say that there was we weren't trying to convict him for something years ago.
So say it's not OJ, though. So take someone else, and what you find is they go in, same case, with guns. You hear there's video recording saying no one's leaving this room.
Yeah, it's a threat.
You know the law, what that says. What is a fair sentencing?
See, that's the thing.
For anyone, just...
So, I was listening to the judge talk about it, and it's because the gun was present. Now, I think when any weapon's present, it is a threat, right? That should be taken serious. I'm a strong believer. We can go into the way I feel about the gun laws and guns in general at another time, but I think
we will at some point. We will definitely be having that
will be a
conversation,
and that will be definitely something that gets some heat from our listeners here.
That will be interesting. I promise you guys. But we'll talk about that another time.
But the thing is so I believe if you have a weapon on you, right? There's some cases will, like I said, cover here because I have a list of cases yay high to cover. There's a ton of cases where people go into it with a weapon but claim that they didn't intend to use it. Yep. My personal feeling on that, I don't know if you guys agree and you can chime in here in a second. I believe if you have a weapon on you ever, even if you're not a bad person, not a criminal, if you have like a license to carry, you're ready and willing to use it if the need be, right? If need be. Not I don't believe people who are strapped in or loaded with guns or carry a switchblade, because I know a lot of people who do that. I don't believe that they're just going to go around stabbing people. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you have the mindset that if need be, you will use it. So in these cases where it's like an armed robbery or armed attempted robbery, whatever the case may be, if you have a weapon, I do think it's used as a scare tactic, but I do think that if I had a gun pointed in my face, I would believe someone was ready to use it. You know what I mean? And I think that does play into sensing. However, I don't know if that means 33 years.
Right. Well, I think the judge in this case also definitely took some time to consider the real preponderance of the evidence that had taken place in not only the civil suit.
And there was video evidence
of the first case, but she considered the preponderance of the evidence not just beyond a reasonable doubt for this case.
Yeah. I
think there was no doubt. This time they had video recording. They had eyewitnesses. You didn't leave anybody that could doubt who this was. So I think, there's a lot of evidence to convict here. But I will say this, Lisa, as John Ryan and I are both, I won't say we're not super experienced, but we're experienced firearm users. John Ryan has a permit to carry. He owns a gun. I have a permit, don't own a gun. But we both have been to a range before. I don't think anybody necessarily wants to fire a gun. They don't have to unless you
no, absolutely.
Batshit crazy.
You don't really go around waving your gun everywhere.
But
someone didn't give you your nuggets.
To your point, should the need arise, I am glad to know that I know how to use one.
Yeah.
So I will agree with you in that sense. Now, but I do want to get back. Sorry, John Ryan, you said did you want to say something there?
I was just going to say the problem is most people that have guns and why most casualties, other than obviously murders, but
intentional murder,
people don't know how to use their guns, and when they go to clean it, they don't know how
blow their head off accidentally.
Exactly. Yeah. So the problem is, if you're gonna own a gun, you have to know how to use it. You have to know how to clean it.
And you have to be responsible, and
exactly.
that's my thing. Like I said, we'll get into it a whole other episode. People would probably consider my stance on guns anti-gun, but that's not it. It's you need to be responsible. We need to stop selling guns to lunatics. But I don't think that's the problem here. I think that's what they held on to convict him with such a high sentence. If he didn't have a gun, I don't think they could peg him for 33 years. I don't think.
But you got to think it's 9 years.
Oh well, yeah, now, right?
Yeah, technically he could be getting out tomorrow.
It's so crazy. He'll be back in jail the next day.
But, I mean...
yeah, he might kill somebody.
Recent news is he was masturbating.
Wait. Update. This blew my mind.
Happened today. Apparently OJ was caught masturbating in front of one of the security guards.
Yeah, one of the COs that he's allegedly been on the block with for several years and knows him well said he's...
So at this point you have to wonder where he's at mentally.
Yeah, we're a little concerned here. So guys, it is it's getting a little late. We do have to wrap this up. But as we said, so to close, I'll just go back over what we talked about a little bit about the first case. OJ was obviously acquitted. We talked a little bit about why we think that might be. Obviously, that is an ongoing debate. We still will be talking about this, I think, in 80 years.
Oh, honestly.
So, we'd love to get your guys' opinions on what you think.
And I'll insert the email once, it's all said and done at the end of this podcast. You'll hear it somewhere around here. So, if you want to give us a shout-out via email, ifor9pod@gmail.com is where you would go.
Absolutely.
But, let's wrap this up. Do you think the punishment fits the crime? Do you think... Let's talk about both. So, for the first trial, do you guys think the punishment fits the crime? And if not, what do you think the punishment should be? Do you think an eye for an eye, where in the literal definition would be take him out back, slit his throat? Do you think a death penalty would have been sufficient? Do you think he didn't deserve the death penalty but did deserve life in prison? What do you think? Do you think it fits the crime?
I think OJ should have received life without parole from the first trial for double man one.
Yeah. What about you?
I totally agree. Murder one, you mean?
Murder
I
one.
think murder. Yeah, I think 100% he was guilty in '93. I think he killed his wife because he was jealous and because he was just
rageful.
Yeah, he was obviously, and I do want to chime this in. Like I said, I do like to play devil's advocate. We're hearing a lot more nowadays about these football-related injuries.
Which are very, very serious.
Which are very serious, and some of these guys are professing to having a lot of anger problems, and I'm talking violence issues too. So, that obviously might have been a mitigating factor.
Concussion's a really good film to watch
is a
if
great
you want to kind of.
But as far as this first case goes, I think we were all in agreement. And like I said, there's a lot of disparity in a lot of communities and a lot of questions and a lot of people polled. Who thought he was guilty, who thought he wasn't. So please, everybody, do your research, and we'd love to hear your guys' opinion. If you guys have formulated one out there, we'd love to hear it. And now I will pose the same question to you guys for trial number 2 in 2008. Was this an eye for an eye? Was this justice? We don't think it was for trial 1. Do we think it was for trial 2? Did OJ get a fair shake the second time around in the court system?
I think it's so hard to say in my personal opinion because you've posed a lot of questions there. I think an eye for an eye was played out. He got sentenced for what I believe he should have been sentenced before.
Initially.
So in the literal definition of, well, not literal, obviously we're not barbarians, we're not taking him out and slitting his throat, but right. I do think justice, quote unquote, would have been served, but I don't think it was served for the crime that he's convicted of, is currently serving time for. I think it's a very, very harsh sentence for a crime where really no violence took place. Meanwhile, this man was acquitted of murder. So it's so backward. I think justice was served, but I don't think, as much as a piece of garbage OJ is, I don't think that the punishment for the second bout of charges fits the crime. I don't. I mean, I guess armed robbery obviously plays but I don't think that's what it was. I mean, I do, like you said, you did bring up what he said in the recordings, but it just doesn't feel... It feels too harsh for what it was. What about you guys?
John, you want to chime in there?
I think there just was the opportunity to put a guy who should have been in jail, and even his defense attorney. I mean, it's hard to, like, even in that position, it's hard to.
Who was his defense attorney this time around? Do we know?
Someone different. It wasn't.
It was not the same team. No.
You think he just gave up, or you think no one would represent him?
I'm sure he still had a decent attorney. Don't get me wrong. I couldn't tell you. It wasn't as prominent though, so it's not. And if
not
anybody out there does know,
the other guys he was with though testified against him.
Yeah, a few guys took a commuted sentence. I would like to say that a few guys took a sentence to
saying there were
testify.
Guns.
Yeah, saying that there were guns and that OJ was the ringleader, and that he was the one who.
And there were recordings before, after, and during, and those were taken by the people who were supposed to.
Right. So as I said, there's no real
What do you think, Matt?
I personally believe though that the punishment fit the crime with past legal issues, even though having not convicted the first time, and other times as well down in Florida, a few issues and the domestic violence with Nicole.
You think finally this bastard's getting what he long deserved.
I just think the opportunity was there to put this guy in jail for a long time, and it was taken by everyone involved.
I agree.
I would actually, I think both you guys make excellent points there. I would say, Lisa, you made a good point saying it's both. I think that
it's so hard.
It's a miscarriage of justice, quite frankly. I mean, if we're looking at it blindly, an eye for an eye, no, it's a miscarriage of justice. I think
normal people don't. I wouldn't get 30 years.
Yeah, you asked me if they sentenced me to 30 years, I'd be appealing like that, drop of a hat, and hopefully, I'm.
But that wouldn't happen to you because you weren't.
Because I'm not O.J.
Simpson,
history. Right? But I also think John Ryan makes an excellent point to say that O.J. This was played out over 15 years. Mm-hmm. This wasn't a quick thing. There was incidents in Florida involving him. OJ was in the press. He was in the media.
More came out about his trial as well.
He wrote a freaking book.
He
wrote a confessional book, Frank.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. Like, so this guy...
I did it.
Let's say that in quotes, if I did it. You know? So, like, we're talking about, like, a guy here who's clearly unhinged in some ways. I think it was a miscarriage of justice at some degree. But, like you guys said, you bring up a good point. Over time, we all think he killed 2 people and somehow was let off for that.
Mind-blowing.
Mind-blowing in real life. But we'll say again, it goes back to the same thing. If it wasn't O.J. Simpson,
it was that Akita.
It was that, yeah, it must have been.
Dog.
And
the
that,
dog did
and your little dog, too. But, so, yeah,
we'll
we
see
will
what
say,
happens tomorrow.
For an eye, I don't think OJ. I think he went 0 for 2, but at the same time, I do believe that
justice was served.
But
I mean, we say that now, but tomorrow everything might change.
Right, we will find
Bastard
out tomorrow.
May walk free.
More information to come, you guys. But
we'll probably have an update Minnesota about this. You know, updating
for sure.
From tomorrow's hearing, and
we'll chime in a little bit later as more information comes out. But I think for now, I want to just thank you guys for getting involved with this.
We want to thank all of you for listening.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, you should come back all the time.
John Ryan, come back whenever.
We have a gazillion cases to cover. You got to come back for every single one.
And this is something
I'll be hopping in and out of the studio for sure.
Yeah, thank you for coming in tonight.
So we thank you for listening. Like I said, we'll plug the email here. So if you want to give us a shout out via email, iforanipod@gmail.com is where you would go. Let us know your opinions. That's what this whole thing's about. Like I said, we don't care if you're a stranger, if you're our best friend. If you want to be part of this podcast, want to Skype in, want to FaceTime in, want to call in, if you have a favorite case of hometown murder, something that really irks you, something where you feel like the trial either does fit the crime, doesn't fit the crime, could be better, could be worse, we want to hear from you. We want to hear about it. We want to know. We want to talk about it. I mean, the best part of this podcast is we all have different opinions. We agree to disagree, or we agree, and that makes it special. At the end of the day, does the punishment fit the crime? That's really the question we're trying to answer, and we'd love to hear from you guys. You know, does the punishment fit the crime?
Right. Ultimately, I mean, we can sit here and it's 2, maybe 3 people whose opinions are weighed in, but we want to hear from you guys. Ultimately, that's why we're doing this. We did this. This was Lisa's idea, but we love the idea of connecting with more people on something that we're really interested in.
So tell your friends, tell your fam, if anyone likes true crime. Like I said, these are all of our own personal opinions. Yes, we did research. Yes, a lot of it's based in fact. However, obviously, the basis of the podcast is our opinions, so don't hate us too much.
Right.
OJ is a garbage truck of a person.
According to Lisa, okay, just keep in mind, so that's according to Lisa.
He is a garbage truck of a person.
Now, since you just mentioned, I want to thank a little bit of admonishing here. We did ESPN, we did FX, we covered them, but I want to personally thank some of the people that have done such great work to study and really research this case and then put the information so accessibly online or in film form.
Absolutely.
You guys are the superstars, and we're just here talking about it. So I appreciate all that being public. And as I said, anybody that's interested, please check out the documentary OJ Made in America, the ESPN films, or the FX series, The People versus OJ Simpson. Both were excellent sources of information for us. And we want to leave this open to debate, so we're going to end it with a question, if that's okay with you guys.
Yes, absolutely.
Was this a fair sentence? This is a multiple-part question, so be prepared. Was this a fair sentence? Was it make up for the case in 1995, the second trial? Do you believe OJ was really this bastard piece of garbage that Lisa was? That Lisa was?
I am not garbage.
I'm saying that Lisa was saying, I meant to finish the sentence that Lisa was saying, and I was going to say was echoing, but you did say it. So, but I want to hear your guys' opinion too. I personally would agree with Lisa in some sense that he is a piece of shit. You know, this guy really is a murderer, and he got off on it just off of being a kind of a schmoozer and a charming guy, but we want to hear your opinion, so we're going to leave it open to debate. I once again want to thank my co-host, Lisa, and my brother, John Ryan.
Thank you, John Ryan.
Thank you,
It's been a pleasure to hang with you guys, chat about some OJ the Juice, watch some
Bucko
wins here, bringing home the W. All right, well, thank you guys so much. Give us your feedback. Answer those questions. We'd love to hear from you. Have a good night.
Good night, guys.
If you or anyone you know is in an abusive relationship, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Their phone and chat services are available to anyone who has been affected by relationship abuse, including those who are currently in abusive relationships, those who are working to heal, friends or family of victims and survivors, and anyone in the community who has questions about domestic violence. They have the ability to provide phone services in more than 200 languages, and their number is 1-800-799-7233. You're not alone, and you never will be.
Report, Clark County, Nevada. The state of Nevada plaintiff versus Orenthal James Simpson, defendant. Case number C